Emma wiped the dust from her tired eyes as she climbed the creaky wooden stairs to her grandmother's attic. The old house groaned under her feet with each step. At 25 years old, Emma felt like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her days started before sunrise at the local coffee shop, where she served endless cups of coffee to sleepy customers. When that shift ended, she rushed home to check on Grandmother Rose, then headed to her evening job at the grocery store. Between working 2 jobs and caring for her sick grandmother, Emma had no time for the one thing that had always brought her joy: painting. Her art supplies sat forgotten in a corner of her tiny bedroom, gathering dust just like everything else that mattered to her. The attic was stuffy and filled with the smell of old wood and forgotten memories. Boxes and trunks were stacked everywhere, holding decades of family history. Emma was searching through the cluttered space, looking for Rose's thick winter blankets. The weather was getting colder and her grandmother needed extra warmth to stay comfortable. As Emma moved an old lamp out of the way, she noticed something tucked behind a large trunk in the corner. It was a small wooden box, different from the cardboard boxes surrounding it. The wood was dark with age and the corners were worn smooth. Something about it called to her. Emma carefully lifted the box and felt her heart skip a beat. It was heavier than she expected and she could hear something shifting inside. She sat down on an old chair and gently opened the lid. Inside the box, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, was a black and white photograph. When Emma unwrapped it, she gasped so loudly that the sound echoed in the quiet attic. The photograph showed a young woman standing proudly in front of what looked like an art studio. The woman wore a paint-stained apron around her waist, and her hands were covered in what must have been paint or clay. But it was her face that took Emma's breath away. The woman in the photograph looked exactly like Emma. Not similar, exactly like her. She had the same gentle curve to her smile, the same bright, hopeful eyes that seemed to sparkle even in the old photograph. The same wavy hair that never stayed quite where it was supposed to. It was like looking into a mirror that showed her dressed in clothes from another time. Emma's hands trembled as she held the photograph closer to the dusty attic window, trying to see more details in the fading afternoon light. The woman stood with such confidence, such pure joy, that Emma felt a strange mixture of wonder and sadness wash over her. "Grandmother Rose?" Emma called out as she carefully made her way down the attic stairs, still holding the photograph like it was made of glass. Her voice echoed through the old house. Rose was sitting in her favorite armchair by the living room window, wrapped in a soft blue shawl. Despite being in her 80s and dealing with health problems, Rose's mind was still sharp, and her eyes were kind. When she looked up and saw what Emma was carrying, her weathered face completely transformed. Her eyes lit up with a mixture of surprise and deep emotion. "Oh, my dear child," Rose said softly, reaching out with shaking hands to touch the photograph. "That's your great-grandmother Grace. She was just about your age when that picture was taken." Emma sat down on the small stool beside her grandmother's chair, studying the image even more closely now. Grandmother Rose, she looked so confident, so full of life. What happened to her? I've never heard you talk about her before. Rose's eyes grew misty with unshed tears as she gazed at the photograph. Her voice became quiet and distant, as if she was traveling back through decades of memories. Grace was the most talented artist in our entire town. Everyone knew about her gift. She could paint anything: people, landscapes, flowers, and make them come alive on the canvas. Emma leaned forward, hungry to learn more about this mysterious relative who looked so much like her. She had actually won a scholarship, Rose continued, her voice full of pride and old sadness. Can you imagine, Emma? A full scholarship to study art in London. In those days that was like winning the lottery. Grace was going to be somebody important, somebody whose paintings would hang in galleries. So what happened? Emma asked, though something in her heart already knew the answer wouldn't be happy. Rose sighed deeply. Then the war came. Everything changed overnight. Grace had to stay home to help with the family. Her father had been injured, and they needed her to work and take care of everyone. She married young, had children right away, and those beautiful paints of hers just gathered dust in the closet. Emma felt tears beginning to build in her eyes. Did she ever paint again? Even a little bit? Rose smiled through her own tears. She taught art to the neighborhood children for free. Every Saturday morning she would set up easels in our backyard and teach any child who wanted to learn. She used to say, "If I can't chase my own dreams, I can at least help others find theirs." That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She placed Grace's photograph on the small table beside her bed where she could see it in the moonlight streaming through her window. She stared at that confident, hopeful face and felt a strange connection to this woman she had never met but somehow understood completely. For the first time in years, Emma fell asleep thinking about painting instead of worrying about bills and responsibilities. The next morning, Emma woke up with Grace's photograph still fresh in her mind. She had barely slept, thinking about her great-grandmother's lost dreams and wondering what other secrets her family's past might hold. After making breakfast for Rose and helping her take her morning medicines, Emma decided she needed to learn more about Grace's story. Rose had mentioned that Grace used to teach art classes at the old community center, so Emma decided that would be her first stop. The building was about 15 minutes away from their house, a brick structure that had seen better days but still served the neighborhood after all these years. When Emma walked through the front doors, she was greeted by the smell of old books and cleaning supplies. The floors creaked under her feet as she made her way to the front desk, where an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes was organizing a stack of papers. "Excuse me," Emma said politely. "I'm looking for information about someone who used to teach here many years ago. My great-grandmother, Grace." The woman looked up and smiled warmly. "Oh my goodness, are you related to Grace? I'm Mrs. Margaret and I've been working here for 40 years. I remember Grace very well indeed." Emma felt her heart jump with excitement. Finally, someone who had actually known Grace personally. Mrs. Margaret's face lit up as she spoke about Grace. "She was like sunshine on the darkest days, that woman was. I was just a young volunteer when I first met her, but I'll never forget the way she made everyone feel special. Even though she never got to pursue her own dreams of studying art in London, she never let bitterness touch her heart. Not even once." Emma leaned against the counter, eager to hear more. "Rose told me she taught children here. What was she like as a teacher?" Mrs. Margaret chuckled softly. "Grace had this magical way with children. She could take the shyest, most nervous child and help them discover they had artistic talent they never knew existed. Every Saturday morning, this place would fill with laughter and the sound of children excited about creating something beautiful." Mrs. Margaret paused as if remembering something important. "You know, I think there might be something that would interest you. Follow me." She led Emma down a narrow hallway that Emma had never noticed before. At the end of the hall was a door marked "Storage." Mrs. Margaret pulled out a ring of keys and unlocked the door, revealing a room filled with boxes, old furniture and forgotten items from decades past. "When we renovated this place 20 years ago," Mrs. Margaret explained as she moved carefully between the stored items, "we found some of Grace's paintings tucked away in what used to be her classroom. No one knew what to do with them, so we kept them safe, hoping that someday someone from her family might come looking." Emma's hands began to shake as Mrs. Margaret approached a corner where 3 large rectangular objects were leaning against the wall, each one covered with an old white sheet that had yellowed with age. "Are those?" Emma whispered, unable to finish her question. Mrs. Margaret nodded and carefully pulled away the first sheet. When it fell to the floor, Emma's breath caught in her throat completely. The painting was absolutely extraordinary. Grace had captured a group of children sitting around a table covered with paintbrushes and colorful paints. But it wasn't just the technical skill that amazed Emma, it was the way Grace had painted the pure joy and wonder on each child's face as they discovered the magic of creating art for the first time. The brush strokes were confident and full of life, showing a natural talent that should have been celebrated in galleries around the world. Mrs. Margaret removed the sheets from the other 2 paintings, and each one was just as breathtaking. One showed children working on a large mural together, their faces serious with concentration but glowing with pride. The third painting depicted a little girl holding up her first completed artwork, her eyes shining with accomplishment. "She painted these while she was teaching?" Emma asked, her voice full of amazement. Mrs. Margaret nodded. Grace always said that teaching art was just as important as creating it. She truly believed that passing on the gift of creativity to the next generation was her real calling in life. She used to tell me, "Margaret, when I see a child discover they can create something beautiful, that's worth more than any gallery show." Emma spent the rest of the day walking around the neighborhood, talking to elderly residents who still remembered Grace. Each person she met had a different story to share, but they all painted the same picture of a woman who had turned disappointment into purpose. Mrs. Helen from the corner house told Emma how Grace had encouraged her to keep drawing even when other adults said art was a waste of time. Mr. Thomas from 3 streets over remembered how Grace had organized community art shows to raise money for families who couldn't afford food during difficult times. Mrs. Sarah, who now used a walking cane, smiled as she recalled how Grace had patiently taught her granddaughter to paint flowers, helping the shy girl find her voice through art. Walking home that evening as the sun was setting, Emma felt something stirring deep in her heart. It was a mixture of sadness for Grace's unfulfilled dreams and incredible inspiration from her generous spirit. Grace had taken her broken dreams and used them to build something even more beautiful, a legacy of creativity, kindness, and hope that had touched dozens of lives across generations. Emma couldn't stop thinking about Grace's paintings after seeing them in the storage room. The images stayed in her mind day and night, those confident brushstrokes, the way Grace had captured pure joy on children's faces, the talent that had been hidden away for decades. During her shifts at the coffee shop, Emma found herself sketching Grace's paintings from memory on napkins. At the grocery store, she daydreamed about those beautiful colors and wondered how many other people would love to see Grace's work. After a week of thinking, Emma made a decision that surprised even herself. She would organize a small exhibition at the community center to honor her great-grandmother's memory and share Grace's beautiful work with the town. It felt like the right thing to do. Grace had given so much to the community through her teaching, and now the community deserved to see her artistic gift. Emma spent the next 3 weeks preparing for the exhibition with more energy than she had felt in years. She used almost all of her small savings account to print colorful flyers advertising the event. She walked through the entire neighborhood, posting flyers on telephone poles and asking shop owners to put them in their windows. She spent hours carefully cleaning Grace's paintings and buying simple frames that would show them properly. The hardest decision came when Emma was setting up the display. She had brought along a small folder of her own sketches, simple drawings she had made during her few quiet moments between work shifts. They were nothing fancy, just pencil drawings of Rose sleeping in her chair, the view from their kitchen window, her tired face in the mirror after long days. Emma stared at her simple drawings next to Grace's masterful paintings and felt embarrassed. But something in her heart told her to display them anyway. Maybe it was Grace's spirit encouraging her, or maybe it was her own need to finally share her art with someone other than herself. Emma hung her sketches on a small section of wall, hoping people would be too busy looking at Grace's work to pay much attention to her amateur attempts. The night of the exhibition arrived, and Emma spent the entire day feeling nervous and excited. She had borrowed tables from the community center and set up a small area with cookies and tea. She arranged Grace's 3 paintings so they would be the first things people saw when they walked in. Everything looked perfect, and Emma felt proud of what she had accomplished. But as 7 o'clock arrived and the exhibition officially began, Emma's heart started to sink. Only a handful of people came through the doors. Most were elderly residents who had known Grace personally, like Mrs. Margaret and a few others Emma had spoken to during her research. A couple of curious neighbors stopped by, looked around politely for a few minutes and then left. Emma tried to smile as she explained Grace's story to the small crowd, sharing what she had learned about her great-grandmother's dreams and her years of teaching children. But inside she felt completely defeated. She had spent weeks planning this event, used her savings and put her heart into honoring Grace's memory. Now she was standing in a nearly empty room, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. Maybe dreams are meant to stay dreams, Emma thought sadly as she watched people slowly leave. Maybe some things are better left in storage rooms where they can't disappoint anyone. As the evening grew later and people began to say their goodbyes, Emma started to think about cleaning up and going home. She felt embarrassed and foolish for thinking that anyone would care about paintings by someone they had never heard of. But then she noticed that one person was still there. A well-dressed elderly gentleman had been standing in front of Grace's paintings for nearly an hour, studying them very carefully. He had gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew about important things. Emma was too shy to approach him at first, but when he continued to stare at the paintings with such intense focus, she finally walked over. "Thank you for staying so long," Emma said quietly. "I know the paintings aren't displayed very professionally, but I wanted people to see Grace's work." The man turned to her with a gentle smile. "Young lady," he said in a refined voice, "I'm James and I've been dealing in art for 50 years. Your great-grandmother was truly exceptional." Emma looked up at him with surprise. She had expected polite comments, but something in his voice sounded serious and genuine. "Really? You think so?" James nodded seriously, turning back to look at Grace's paintings. Grace's style was revolutionary for her time. She blended traditional techniques with modern expression in ways that were decades ahead of her era. The way she captured emotion, the confidence of her brushwork, the composition. These paintings should be hanging in galleries, not hidden away in storage rooms. Emma felt her heart racing. No one had ever talked about Grace's work this way before. But she never got the chance to show her work professionally. She was just a local art teacher. James turned to look directly at Emma, his expression gentle but firm. "That doesn't make her any less of an artist," he replied. Talent doesn't disappear just because the world doesn't recognize it immediately. Some of the greatest artists in history were never appreciated during their lifetimes. He paused and walked over to the wall where Emma had hung her simple sketches. After studying them for a few moments, he looked back at Emma. "And I can see that same spark in your work too." For the first time in months, Emma felt a flicker of hope burning in her chest. James offered to help Emma organize a proper art exhibition that would feature both Grace's rediscovered paintings and Emma's own artwork. His offer came like a dream that Emma had never dared to imagine. But then he paused and looked at her seriously. "There's one condition though," James said gently. "You'll need to create more pieces. Much more. Your great-grandmother's legacy deserves to be paired with work that shows your full potential, not just a few sketches." Emma felt her stomach flutter with a mixture of terror and excitement. She had never created a full collection of paintings before. Her art had always been something she did in stolen moments between responsibilities, quick sketches on napkins or small drawings in the margins of notebooks. "How many paintings would I need?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James thought for a moment. "At least 10 or 12 pieces. Real paintings, not sketches. They need to tell your story alongside Grace's." Emma was terrified, but something deep inside her felt more determined than she had ever been in her life. That night, she went home and looked at Grace's photograph for a long time. If Grace could teach dozens of children while raising her own family and never complaining about her lost dreams, then Emma could find a way to paint while working 2 jobs. Emma began painting every free moment she could find. She woke up an hour earlier each morning and painted in the kitchen while the coffee brewed. During her breaks at work, she made sketches that she would turn into paintings later. Late into the night, after Rose had gone to sleep and the house was quiet, Emma set up her easel in the corner of her bedroom and painted by the light of a small lamp. She painted the things she knew best, the exhaustion she felt after working 16-hour days, but also the satisfaction of earning money to care for Rose. She painted her hands, stained with coffee and marked by cuts from handling grocery boxes, but holding a paintbrush with such tenderness. She painted Rose sleeping in her favorite chair, surrounded by the love that filled their small home despite their struggles. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Emma's entire life. Her small savings account grew smaller and smaller as she bought canvases, paints, and brushes instead of groceries. Some days, Emma ate only bread and peanut butter so she could afford the art supplies she needed. Her hands became permanently stained with paint, and her eyes grew tired from painting in dim light. To make things worse, Rose's health began declining. The cold weather was hard on her lungs, and she needed more expensive medications that their insurance didn't cover completely. Some nights, Emma would sit beside Rose's bed, watching her grandmother struggle to breathe, and wonder if she was being selfish by spending money on paint instead of better medicine. Emma collapsed into bed exhausted every night, wondering if she was chasing an impossible dream. Maybe James had been wrong about her talent. Maybe she was just a tired young woman who worked in a coffee shop and should be grateful for what she had instead of reaching for something she didn't deserve. But every time doubt crept into her mind, Emma would look at Grace's photograph sitting on her bedside table. She would remember her great-grandmother's words that Rose had shared, "If I can't chase my own dreams, I can at least help others find theirs." Slowly, Emma began to understand something that changed everything. Grace hadn't given up her dreams, she had transformed them. Instead of becoming a famous artist in London, she had become something even more important. She had planted seeds of creativity in dozens of children. She had shown them that art mattered, that beauty could be created even in difficult circumstances, that dreams were worth pursuing even when the path looked impossible. Emma realized that Grace had been helping her all along, through her example of strength and resilience, through her belief that art could change lives, and through her understanding that sometimes dreams take generations to fulfill. Grace's dream of studying art in London was finally happening, just 50 years later and in a different way than anyone could have expected. With 2 weeks left until the exhibition, Emma stepped back and counted her completed paintings. 12 pieces lined the walls of her small bedroom, each one telling part of her story. They were raw and honest, showing the struggles of working multiple jobs and caring for a sick relative, but also the love that made those struggles worthwhile. They showed a young woman finding her artistic voice while honoring the dreams of those who came before her. The paintings weren't perfect and Emma knew that. But they were real and they were hers, and they carried forward something beautiful that Grace had started decades ago. The night before the exhibition opening, Emma sat beside Rose's bed. Her grandmother was feeling stronger after starting a new treatment that Emma had been able to pay for with the small amount of money she had made from selling 2 sketches to people who had attended the first exhibition. Rose reached out and took Emma's paint-stained hand in her own weathered fingers. "Grace would be so proud of you," Rose whispered, her eyes bright with tears of joy. "You found a way to make both of your dreams come true." Emma smiled, feeling ready to step into her future while carrying her family's artistic legacy forward. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring, but tonight she felt complete. The exhibition opening exceeded everyone's wildest expectations. Emma had expected maybe 20 or 30 people to attend, but by 7 o'clock that evening, the community center was packed with visitors. Word had spread through James's contacts in the art world and through social media posts that people had shared again and again. Art lovers, critics, and curious visitors had traveled from neighboring towns to see the remarkable story of Grace and Emma. Emma stood nervously by Grace's paintings, watching in amazement as people's faces lit up when they discovered her great-grandmother's incredible work. She listened to conversations happening all around her and could hardly believe what she was hearing. A young art student was explaining to her friend, "Can you believe this woman was painting like this in the 1950s? Look at the way she used color and composition. She was so far ahead of her time. This work should be in museums." An elderly man who had driven 2 hours to attend was telling his wife, "I've been studying art for 40 years and I've never seen anything quite like this." The emotion she captured in these children's faces is extraordinary. Emma felt tears of joy building in her eyes as she realized that Grace was finally getting the recognition she had deserved all those years ago. People understood her great-grandmother's talent and were celebrating it in ways Grace had never been able to experience during her lifetime. When visitors moved to Emma's section of the exhibition, she held her breath and watched their reactions carefully. Her paintings told a very personal story of struggle and hope, and she worried that people might find them too simple or too honest. But the response was overwhelming. A working mother stood for 10 minutes in front of Emma's painting that showed her caring for Rose during a difficult night. The woman wiped tears from her eyes as she read the small description Emma had written about finding love and purpose even in the hardest moments. A young man who looked like he had worked long hours at a difficult job spent a long time studying Emma's painting about finding hope through hardship. He talked quietly with his girlfriend about how the painting reminded him of his own struggles to chase his dreams while supporting his family. An older couple looked at Emma's painting of her paint-stained hands holding a brush and nodded to each other with understanding. They had clearly faced their own challenges in pursuing creative dreams while dealing with practical responsibilities. By the end of the evening, Emma could hardly believe what had happened. She had sold 8 of her 12 paintings. People had paid real money for her art, telling her that her work spoke to them and that they wanted to take a piece of her story home with them. The money from those sales was enough to secure Rose's medical care for the next year and even rent a small studio space where Emma could continue painting and maybe display Grace's work permanently. As the crowd thinned and people began to leave, James approached Emma with a warm smile and genuine pride in his eyes. "Congratulations, Emma," he said, shaking her paint-stained hand. "This is just the beginning of your artistic journey. Grace would be amazed to see how her legacy has inspired such beautiful work." 3 months later, Emma stood in her new studio with a paintbrush in her hand, still hardly believing that this space belonged to her. The walls displayed both Grace's rediscovered paintings and her own growing collection of new work. Sunlight streamed through large windows, making the colors in all the paintings seem to glow with life. Emma had quit her evening job at the grocery store and was now able to focus on her art while still helping Rose and working part-time at the coffee shop. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe freely and dream about the future. A soft knock on the studio door interrupted her thoughts. When Emma opened it, she found a group of children from the neighborhood standing outside, led by a shy young girl with pigtails who looked about 8 years old. "Miss Emma," the girl said quietly, looking down at her feet and then back up at Emma. "My name is Lucy. We heard that you might teach us to paint like your great-grandmother did? My mom said Grace used to teach children here a long time ago." Emma's heart filled with pure joy as she remembered Grace's true calling and the stories Rose had told her about those Saturday morning art classes. She looked at the hopeful faces of the children and saw the same excitement that Grace must have seen in the faces of her young students decades ago. Emma opened the door wide, welcoming the children into the studio where creativity and dreams lived on. "Of course," she said warmly. "Grace always believed that teaching art was just as important as creating it. I think she would love to know that children are still excited about learning to paint." That evening, after the children had gone home with paint-stained fingers and huge smiles, Emma sat in her studio holding 2 photographs. In one hand was the old black and white image of Grace that had started her entire journey. In the other hand was a new color photograph from the exhibition opening that showed Emma surrounded by people celebrating art and family legacy. Emma understood now that dreams don't die when they seem impossible to achieve. Instead, they transform and grow and find new ways to bloom across generations. Grace's unfulfilled dream of studying art in London had become something even more beautiful, a legacy of creativity, resilience, and hope that would inspire others for years to come.